Time for the tactics meeting. Episode 21, Safety Officer. I'm your host, Dan Smiley, and here on the tactics meeting, we talk to subject matter experts about response tactics and technology. We'll begin this week's episode with a safety minute, and to help us, we have Amy Duz from iWorkWise. Hi, Amy, and welcome to the program.
Hi, Dan. Thank you.
The topic for today is IDLH atmospheres. Amy, what do employees need to know?
First thing is that IDLH stands for immediately dangerous to life and health. It's not a one breath and you're dead level, but it has a little bit of a slap factor where you would have a hard time self-rescuing after 30 minutes of exposure. The biggest thing, the most important thing to know about IDLH is it dictates respiratory protection. Once you cross that line, no matter what state you're in or federally, anywhere in the United States, you're in supplied air or self-contained breathing apparatus, SCBA. So over any chemicals, IDLH amount that's set, that you're in supplied air.
Amy, how do we find what a chemical's IDLH is?
Those levels are set by NIOSH. The best way is to look online these days and use a search engine. It's also on SDSs. If you have a current SDS, you should have the current IDLH information there. Again, it's a national number. It's not going to vary by state like some other exposure numbers. One other thing to think about, Dan, is as always, when you're working in a hazardous environment, continuous air monitoring is a must. You should know what levels you're working in.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Thanks for helping to keep us safe.
Thanks, Dan.
So having helped us with our safety minute, Amy's going to help me dig into the role of the safety officer. It's going to be an amazing episode, so here we go. Amy Duz, welcome to the program.
Hey, Dan. Nice to be with you again.
Hey, today we're going to talk about the role of the safety officer. And this is a topic I've really been focused on over the last few months. I've found it a little difficult to find the information I need on what the training requirements are, what the certification requirements are, if any, who can fill this role of safety officer. So I'm super excited that you're here on the program today to help unlock some of this information.
You bet. And, we've talked about it over the years, and I think this is a great conversation to have, kind of an evolution of both of us spending, a professional lifetime in the industry and involved in response. So this is, I'm excited. I love the stuff where we dig in.
Well, I am focused on this from the perspective of being an oil spill response incident commander, and I'm activated and end up on site. And until I have a safety officer assigned, I'm the safety officer, and I'm looking around. I've got some contracts with people, but it's more and more difficult to find people who are qualified to do this job. And the thing that I keep running into is kind of a fake safety thing, where there's a safety officer who's running around telling people to, put on a hard hat or wear safety glasses, but they're unable to do hazard identification or hazard evaluation or prioritization or hazard control. I think you've experienced some of the same frustrations.
Oh, what I tell my people all the time is, a lot of good safety glasses will do you if you get blown up. So you've got to find a way to prioritize in this whole thing. And, safety, I've seen it happen so many times where it's both kind of an art and a science, and there's a lot to know to avoid these pitfalls and help other people to not get killed at work. But it's, it takes some of that experience and knowledge. And when we see, a safety officer, besides the incident commander, is the only real person in the ICS system that's called out specifically, that has specific requirements of them or duties in a response. I mean, obviously, you're going to have use the incident command system, but they call it specifically some things about a safety officer, and they don't necessarily about all the other positions. And I find that kind of telling. There's an importance here, and as response professionals, we don't want to miss the forest for the trees, right?
No, that's exactly it. So in the HAZWOPER standard, OSHA specifically calls out for a safety officer. They don't call out for a public information officer, a liaison officer, operations section chief. They call for an incident commander and a safety officer. So if you don't have a safety officer on site, you're in essence violating federal law.
Yeah. I mean, the regulation says the individual in charge of the ICS shall designate a safety officer.
Right. Shall designate a safety officer.
Yes.
It's not optional.
No. And when we look at what their responsibilities and authority are, I don't think it was meant to be just fill the position and check some boxes.
Well, that's the thing. So in oil spill response, we focus on the hazards of petroleum products, and they're pretty straightforward as to flammability and toxicity. But when we're responding to an incident that's taken place on a ship, oil is not the only problem. There can be chlorine. I mean, there could be refrigerated cargo holds, which means there's either Freon or ammonia. There can be compressed oxygen. There can be acetylene. There's paints. There's thinners. The list just goes on and on. I might as well just start reading page by page through the NIOSH Pocket Guide.
Yeah, that's a working operation of the ship, and then there's all the weird stuff that could be cargo. Right.
Oh, yeah, right. So back in the day when I sailed for Western Pioneer, I mean, I had a HAZWOPER class, but I really didn't know this stuff. And when I think of the cargo that I had in some of the cargo holds, including compressed gas cylinders, I'm embarrassed that I didn't ventilate those hatches and do some air monitoring prior to sending crews down. But I was young and I won't get so far as to say stupid, but certainly ignorant.
Yeah, I felt the same way before too. I mean, you don't know what you don't know, and that youth and inexperience, I think, is the key thing. You don't have the training, knowledge, and experience to evaluate the hazards properly. And, we all kind of grew up saying, we use barbecues, so we kind of realize what propane, does. But, when a house got leveled in my neighborhood by a barbecue cylinder and there's nothing left except the chimney, I thought, that's a lot of energy out of that one little 5-gallon unit. And I've been working in hazmat my whole life. I mean, obviously I've seen levees and, propane, whatever. I've been trained as much as anybody can be, I think. But, you don't get it without some depth, and if you're the safety officer, you're supposed to, at that operation, that emergency response operation, and it's spelled out in federal law, you have specific responsibility to identify and evaluate hazards and to provide direction with respect to the safety of operations for the emergency at hand. So, you might be able to identify, if you're an inexperienced person just kind of getting thrown in, you kind of identify, they might have this, they might have refrigerants or something. But to truly evaluate the hazards, given the damage during maybe fire conditions, flooding conditions, right? To evaluate those hazards properly to ensure that response is safe, it's a little more than checking boxes. You got to understand.
So are there certification requirements that you're aware of for safety officers? I mean, OSHA says you you will assign a safety or shall assign a safety officer, but does it go any farther into telling you what requirements a person needs to have, what training they need to have in order to fill that role?
No, let me tell you, I'll tell you what the sketchy information is, right? So not only us, but anyone who might be listening can kind of, weigh it for themselves. So there's no real definition of a safety officer. There's the regular requirements for awareness level training, for operations level training, or defensive or technician level training, offensive, right? And through the incident commander. But there isn't anything specifically called out for a safety officer. So when we kind of go back to the beginning of the HAZWOPER standard, there is a definition for site safety and health supervisor or official. And that's not a safety officer, right? I mean, these regs are literal, and the HAZWOPER reg covers in the paragraphs up till Q hazardous waste sites, right? And we have paragraph Q that covers emergency response. So, the site safety and health supervisor kind of is referred to in the hazardous waste part, but this is all we have, right? This is the only thing that kind of mentions it. So what the definition is with that caveat is it's the person who's responsible to the employer and has the authority and knowledge necessary to implement the site safety and health plan and verify compliance with applicable safety and health requirements. Clearly in an emergency, as the requirements are one thing, but the authority and knowledge necessary, right? And if we go back to the two paragraphs in the standard that talk about safety officer, we're talking about, I think, kind of a performance standard where does that safety officer, can they identify and evaluate those hazards? Do they have the knowledge and expertise to provide direction, right? And the hazards, like you talked about, could be myriad. It's not necessarily just diesel in the water, right? There could be a lot of other things. So you show up and you think, oh, I have a shipboard spill or I have a shipboard fire, and holy smokes, you're going to have to keep your responder safe from all the things that might be on there. It's not just boots and rain gear.
Yeah, I had an OSRO not that long ago, an oil spill response organization, tell me that they couldn't help with a safety officer or provide anybody in safety because they don't do hazmat, and they're focused on this idea that they're there to skim oil off the water or clean oil off the water, and that's the only hazard. But that's never the only hazard. So when they told me, well, we don't do hazmat, it's like, well, then go home because you're not going to stay here.
Yeah. And it's a hole in the industry, which is, I think, why we talked about talking about this and involving other professionals and, getting some thinking caps on across the board, because, it doesn't seem like a great cadre of trained safety officers who are more than qualified. So we talked. Yeah, let's backtrack a little bit. We talked a little bit about the one paragraph. The safety officer is someone who is knowledgeable in the operations, so they have to be involved with the incident commander, know what's going on and what's planned, and they have to identify and evaluate hazards and provide direction. The other paragraph, the only other thing we really have to go on, is the part about their authority, and it says when activities are judged by the safety officer to involve imminent danger, they shall have the authority to alter, suspend, or terminate those activities. The safety officer shall immediately inform the individual in charge of the ICS. It's a long way of saying incident commander, isn't it? But they're supposed to immediately inform the incident commander of any actions needed. So, in a way, they can override the incident commander. And one thing I noticed on the spills and drills and things I've attended is very rarely does the safety officer have the chutzpah or the authority or organizational, they're not part of the organization where they're really going to tell the incident commander no, and maybe that isn't needed all the time, but often I see a big emphasis on little things because maybe they don't know what they need to know about the big things, right? And again, the safety classes don't do you much good if you're all blown up.
Right. So the one set of not really regs, but guidance that I found is the National Fire Protection Association's standards, and there's a number of safety officer manuals that have put out. I bought a couple as I was questing through this. I've got David W. Dodson's Fire Department Incident Safety Officer revised 3rd edition in my hand, and it's pretty good, but it still doesn't provide you any idea of a training standard other than meeting these NFPA things. It doesn't say that you need to be a certified safety professional or that you have to be a 24-hour HAZWOPer trained. It's pretty loosey-goosey on the requirement side. So in that regard, it's telling me that I can assign anybody, and of course that's not going to work.
Yeah. And I've also seen that at fire department levels. I've got some experience and certainly a lot of colleagues in the firefighting profession. And, again, we don't see a level of training and knowledge necessarily in the safety officers being assigned at scenes. I think luck, get away with a lot of stuff based on luck. From what I've seen, it's not really based on knowledge or a very strong assessment of the hazards. First identification of the hazards properly, making that a priority. I mean, what the heck is on the ship? Where is it located? Right. I would think that if I was an incident commander, I'd want my safety officer. I mean, that's obviously what they should be spending time on. What I see sometimes on spills is they're spending time developing their briefing, to the incident team or response team before they go in about what they could trip over or if they get a bee sting or, some of that. I mean, those are technically all hazards, but again, I'm, me, Dan, I'm always completely redundant in the fact I always say death first. What's going to kill people? And oxygen displacement, you talked about Freon. If Freon's involved in a fire, we're talking about phosgene gas, ammonia, any compressed gas, pressure vessels on a vessel can levy, right? So there's that where the relief valves discharge to. Often they're plumbed out for all toxic materials. They're plumbed outside the space and somewhere up the gantry or a mast or something are those going to spray on firefighters on the deck. I mean, there is a lot of things that have to be analyzed and processed in a stressful situation by the person who's saying, wait a second, this response action we're taking that we think is simple maybe isn't quite as simple. And the other thing, you could just say, you can just run to the conservative, right? You can say, oh, well, we're barely going to respond to anything because we just can't be sure. Well, that results in a greater loss to the company and the community and actually more endangerment by letting an incident go on and on and on because you just simply don't have the knowledge to respond intelligently. So, there's kind of penalties on both sides, right? You don't know enough, you can get people killed. And you don't know enough, and you end up your response isn't. I mean, it's a no response, or you're doing a lot more damage by taking that ultra conservative thing. So I think clearly my approach is always that competence is the best solution. Instead of the ultra conservative do nothing strategy or the run into everything because we're going to take care of it strategy. What do you think?
We've seen the run into everything strategy, right? Well, there was the ammonia release up in Dutch Harbor where they decided to send an entry team in firefighting bunker gear, and they immediately started experiencing chemical burns. The ammonia concentrations were well up over the 5,000 parts per million that would begin to have corrosive effects. So they came running back out of the ship, and instead of doing something else, they just sent the backup team in to do it again. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
it shows a lack of knowledge, and there's a good instance where you'd have a strong safety officer who'd go, "No, we're not doing that."
Yeah, I mean, and it's really about hazard and risk assessment, right? Which you could relabel as a cost-benefit analysis. What is it that we are going to gain by sending our team in there? And if your fire is in the middle of nowhere and you can stand back and let it burn out, well, that might be a valid choice. If your situation is right in the middle of a populated area, and life safety of civilians is an issue, then your objectives change. And safety officers need to be able to evaluate these hazards with these priorities in mind. And I don't always feel like people who have the knowledge to conduct those hazard assessments are available to me.
Oh, and the longer I'm in this, if I'm showing up to an incident, I always am going to be in the default no-go position, right? So if you come at an incident that way, I mean, I'm not planning on no-going, but I'm starting that way. Instead of starting as get suited up, we're going to go do something. In my mind, this is an evolution over the years, right? As I start out with, no, we're not going. We're going to make sure people are safe where they're assembled. We're going to make sure the perimeters are right. We're going to make sure community is protected and other people are protected. And then we're like, what can we do? Right? What can we do? And then you're like, could we do this safely? Yeah, I think we can do that safely because we don't have, there's no circumstance here where I'm going to get people killed. We can get in there. What else can we do safely? Right? What else can we do safely? And I think that can be, that process could take 5 minutes, right? So you're taking care of your community or whatever, and you're looking at the hazards and you're saying, what is it that we could do with a pretty much a guarantee of safety, right? And if you're good with hazards, people who work around ammonia, you brought up ammonia. So it's corrosive gas, pungent, suffocating odor, right? It's not sneaky at all. I love ammonia because, the stronger it smells, the stronger it is, and you won't willingly stay in a situation that'll kill you. But it's a compressed gas, right? So you have BLEVE hazards and other things like that. But, when the people who work around ammonia and understand it all the time, they could go, and I'm not advocating this. Okay. Don't do this at home, anybody.
Noted.
I've worked with people who are amazing and they're experts in their field. They've worked with refrigeration systems or ammonia their whole life, and they can approach a raging leak, from the upwind, right? And walk up to it and never smell ammonia. Right? No respiratory equipment, no anything, right? They're not exposed because they understand how it behaves, right? They understand the hazards of that particular leak and they understand how it behaves. So I think, identifying the hazards is really key. And the things that kill people is something that you do first. You do everything that'll kill people. And I think you talk about it in a separate category, right? And that's what you worry about first. And obviously, when you see the high flyer explosions in the 40s, right? What's that other vessel in Texas City, Texas, right?
Oh, the Grand Camp.
Yeah, the Grand Camp and the high flyer, right? Ammonium nitrate explosions or whatever. They didn't clear the docks. They didn't protect the community. And, 500 people plus were killed, right? So what do you take? Death first, right? So is there something that could explode? Right. And then, what else from there? Air hazards, those reach out certainly further than contact hazards. Right. So we're dealing with vapor and gas spread. So explosions and levies, ruptures, that kind of thing. I think that safety officers should be trained to kind of go in and it isn't random, and you shouldn't be thinking about things as all things being equal. This is, like you talked about, hazard and risk, right? This is risk-based evaluation, where we're looking at things and making sure we take care of the big stuff first, and have a 100% handle on the big stuff, because it's our job to make sure our responders don't die, right? No one in the community and other people. And then from there, they don't die and then they don't get injured, right? There's other priorities, but I don't want them killed on my watch, right? So I'm going to look at death first. I'm going to look at the stuff that could blow up. I'm going to look at the stuff that could spread. So first gases and vapors, and then liquids, clearly in oil spills, right? We have spread there. But we want to look at stuff that beyond contact, and then obviously contact, and then you have all the regular site hazards. We don't want people falling off of towers or doing stuff when the regular safety stuff. But the regular safety stuff is not what I would look at first, when coming to an incident. When I look at these two paragraphs, identify and evaluate hazards, it's, first with respect to the emergency. So anyway, you can see I get fired up, Dan. Sorry, I'm going off, but I love this stuff.
Oh, no need to apologize. That last ship fire, we knew it was a refrigerated vessel and that it used ammonia as a refrigerant. But initially, we were told that all the ammonia had been pulled off, and only came to light later that what they meant was pulled back into the high pressure receiver. So getting accurate information when you're showing up to these events can also be really hard. And then they had a bunch of chlorine on board. And yeah, we thought about the release hazards of chlorine by itself, or the levy hazards because it was stored in cylinders as a liquid under pressure. But chlorine and ammonia are not friendly together.
Oh my gosh. Nitrogen trichloride gas.
Nitrogen trichloride gas. Toxic and flammable.
Yeah, and ammonia cartridges don't help.
No, right. Good point.
That's a great point. The combination changes everything, doesn't it? It's really something.
And it's not like there's an NFPA diamond on the side of the ship, right? So
no.
Right. So, getting in there and doing that hazard evaluation is really critical. So who is qualified, and what should we use as a qualification standard? I'm honestly asking. Who is qualified to do this? Do we have to do the training ourselves in-house? Do we say that a 24-hour HAZWOPER technician certificate is required? I went back and I looked at the safety officer training syllabus for ICS that FEMA uses, and for them, it's really about the planning cycle. It's the attending the meetings and developing the health and safety plan and completing the ICS 215 safety evaluation to go with each of the ICS 204 task assignments. But it doesn't provide like a prerequisite requirement to say, hey, before you come in and take this course to be the incident safety officer and function as part of the command staff working through the planning cycle, you already have to be, HAZWOPER trained, certified safety professional trained, or NFPA trained, or whatever. So again, there's a kind of a big hole. Yeah, I can go into a tabletop exercise or go into the command post, and I can develop a site safety plan, and I can attend the meetings, and I can go to the tactics meeting, and I can create a 215A. But it seems to me that that's one skill set, and that I might need an assistant safety officer for hazmat, an assistant safety officer for decon. And I'm sure that in the broader hazmat world, those things are being addressed, but I don't know that we do a good job of that in the oil spill world.
I see sometimes the assignment of the safety, it goes to somebody who's a little bit annoying and doesn't mind nagging people, right? And it really, in some operations I've seen, and I probably was this way when I was younger and didn't know better too, but it's developed a like PPE monitor, and that's not it. I think this job is so much bigger than that. I think it's more of a specialist of what you're going to run into and how to use tools like the ERG. The ERG, the North American Emergency Response Guide, is really only for transportation incidents, but it's a guide, right? It's a guide. It talks about hazards of particular. I think it does a pretty good job. Hazards of particular containers or whatever. If you have nothing else, you have something there to start with, right? And then you need the intelligence and expertise to be able to apply it to your situation. Although it might not apply directly, how can I use that information? I mean, there may be things you don't know you're going to run into, right? For people who apply to ship, people who fulfill the role of safety officer on ships, there is some commonality. I mean, you talked about it, refrigerants, right? Different fuels, chlorine, calcium hypochlorite, powdered chlorine that mixes, how those things mix, definitely even just, fully understanding liquefied compressed gases, right? Or acetylene and how those cylinders fail when they fail, what to expect. They're like great big Roman candles, and their fusible device melts at 212, right? So if you have a deck heating up under an acetylene cylinder, that thing's going to open, and it's going to vent its contents, which include acetone in addition to acetylene. I mean, I want my safety officer knowing this stuff. So when you have somebody showing up who says, we don't do hazmat, and I would have the same reaction you would be, is, wow, I don't need you, right? I think my guys try to not trip over stuff, right? Like that. I think we got that. We've had that through the rest of our training. It's not really even worthy of the safety briefing in some ways. But
oh God, don't even get me started on this. Don't even get me started on the safety briefing.
Oh, come on, let's do it.
I mean, it's like, they're going through this checklist.
It's everybody's favorite part, right, of the whole thing.
And of course, the less you know, the longer the safety briefing takes, because they're going through this thing. It's like, slips, trips, and falls. Wear a hard hat. Be careful of animal bites.
And there's nothing overhead. I love the hard hat one. Everybody's wearing these hard hats, and there's nothing but seagulls flying, right? So for some reason, we need protection from what might happen from a seagull. But I mean, keep going, Dan. I'm with you.
I mean, and it can take a half an hour to go through this thing, and it never really addresses anything at all. So it's interesting that I think the Washington State Department of Ecology recognizes this, because they have a requirement for credit for their drills program, for them to witness a successful safety brief, because they've seen so many horrible ones. And while I'm ranting on about that, so often there's this disconnect between the command post safety officer and the safety plan, and they write it, they get it approved, but it never makes it out into the field. No one ever sees the darn thing, right? So they're always just constantly working off their own checklists, which is not the point.
Yeah, it's a good example of overdue with checklists. We do a lot of audits, of compliance for people, and auditing drills, and just auditing in general. And people often want a checklist, like, oh, I don't know what I need this checklist. But there's the whole world of what isn't on there, and then you have a hyper focus on what is on there, and you're not looking again at the forest for the trees, right?
Well, I mean, people have to recognize that a checklists are there to remind you to do something that you already know how to do. They're there to help you manage complexity, but they're not there to teach you how to do something.
No.
So, and even seasoned professionals, experts use checklists to remind them of things, like pilots. So I'm in favor of checklists, but they're there as a job aid to complete a task that you already know how to do. You can't start with the checklist.
No, checklist isn't. It's really the commonly forgotten things. You don't need to write down, pull the covers back, put my feet on the floor to get out of bed, right? You don't need to write that stuff down, but I might have to say, take your vitamins, or you don't have to write down, drink your coffee, because you're totally motivated to do that. You're not going to miss that step, right? So checklists, like you said, I'm a super fan of them. Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, how Boeing uses checklists, but that's exactly what they are. They're something to jog your mental processes so you don't forget something, and you're managing complexity and you're managing stress. So checklists are an amazing, wonderful tool for a safety officer and a responder, incident commander, right? But they don't substitute for training and knowledge and depth and what it is you're doing.
Well, you had also mentioned something about authority, and I think there's a line in the Haswalper standard that talks about authority. This person needs to be able to break in on a conversation with the incident commander or a unified command and get their point across. And I've thought about this a lot, and it almost seems like one of the training requirements to get to safety officer would be to become a qualified incident commander first and then go to safety officer. I mean, you've got to really understand how to manage the incident, and only then can you step back and look at the safety of the incident. So I'm kind of leaning towards the idea that, hey, to be my safety officer, you have to be qualified to be an incident commander.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, for sure. And I'll think about that more. I'd have to agree with you for now. And there's also the training role of specialist, right? But you never really see the specialist used that much or brought in for a particular material. But let's say your safety officer, when do they bring in a specialist for something? Would be another, topic. You talked about assistant safety officers, right? You might have a specialist who's an assistant safety officer who's a specialist on that particular material, depending on the hazmat. So that there's some interesting stuff to explore. It's just I think in the meantime, maybe if we could get the safety meetings or briefings to be real, not a snooze, to be real, that talk about the things that are specific, or specific isn't even the word, because you could trip anywhere, right? And you could, that would be specific to any incident, right? But there has to be a risk prioritization, I think, in that. And people aren't going to remember 15 minutes of reading off a checklist on everything that could possibly happen to a human being who's outside and dressed, right? There has to, I think as an industry, we should dial back from that kind of stuff and make sure the big stuff is covered, and for sure with 100%, and talk about things that are unique to that incident.
Yeah, my pet peeve of the year for safety has been respiratory protection, as COVID turned N95 into a noun. It was the term du jour for weeks and months. And as I looked around and watched people trying to implement respiratory protection rules, I realized they don't even know what they're wearing. They don't even know what it's for or what the N or the 95 means. So safety officers, in my mind, really have to completely understand
their field, right?
Their field,
safety.
and I don't know, I just don't know that we're accomplishing that all the time, and I'm not trying to criticize anybody in particular. I think I, as an incident commander, have not always succeeded in implementing the safety officer role as well as I could. And one of the reasons that I'm discussing it is that, I'm trying to have constant improvement, to act on lessons learned.
Yeah. The code. Okay. I can't help myself. Right. But during the COVID thing, you bring up the N95, and we know that, respirators are rated one of three letters. Particulate respirators are one of three letters, and also three numbers. And the numbers are efficiency, right? So is it block out 95% of the contaminant, letting 5% by? That's a 95. Or 99. Does it do 99%? Or they have hundreds, which is not quite 100, but really
99.97, they say.
Yeah, or even more nines in there. And so, the number is how much will it filter out. If it filters out 95% of it, you're pretty good. Of course, the longer you're in that environment, the more the 5% could matter. But the first one is the letters, right? The N, the R, and the P. During that whole time, and I'd have to say I laughed, but it wasn't totally with glee, that people didn't understand that. You couldn't find an N95. They're selling them for $200 and they're fake. And, they come out with all these other Chinese variations that aren't NIOSH approved, right? And aren't really great for workplaces. But you could buy an R95, you could buy that for $3, and you could buy a P95, right? And it just makes you laugh because it's still a 95. So it's giving you the 95% particulate efficiency. But we know that N stands for non-oil, the R is oil resistant, and the P is oil proof. So it's whether that material will hold up to an oily particle. So if you're not in a machine shop, no one really cares. So they phase out on that part of the training. But basically, you're looking for a 95% efficient particulate respirator. And there are so few people across the United States that understood it. During COVID, you could buy the R's and the P's. I mean, people at hospitals are suffering, right? Because they don't have the equipment, but they have R's and P's.
Well, I couldn't. I guarantee you, if I'd have handed somebody in a hospital a P100, they'd be like, "No, I can't. I need an N95." What? I need an N95, yeah. Right? P100 means, because they don't understand it at all. And then I know for a fact that there were some hospital settings where people were able to get their hands on powered air purifying respirator, or PAPR. That's another complaint of mine, is that people use the term PAPR and don't even know that it's actually still just an air purifying respirator, and they want to wear an N95 under the PAPR hood.
Right. And of course they're spewing whatever they have. I mean, when we're not talking about workplace contaminants, we're talking about biologicals. A powered air purifying respirator, if they have COVID, right, it's certainly going out around everyone else. It protects them perfect, well, but it doesn't protect the other people. But, we see people, they've gotten smarter, and there's actually some things I'm quite impressed with that people understand about respirators now a little bit better. But when we're talking about us, so often we talk about effectiveness in training, there are levels, right? Taking a respirator training, the same training every year, checking that box, check. It's not the same respirator training that a safety officer should have, right? There's a level where you're administering the program. And OSHA has that in the respiratory protection program, a program administrator. In a way, the safety officer is administering the respirator program as it relates to the emergency response scene, right?
That's
In a
right.
way, they really do need to know a heck of a lot more about respirators than a regular person. Not in a way, let's say unequivocally, they need to know more about respirators than the regular employee, right? And are the safety officers getting that kind of training? I'm not convinced they are.
No, I'm not convinced that they are either. Because I talked to a number of people who were safety officers for various organizations during COVID, and it was clear while talking about this exact, N95 versus R97 discussion that they did not understand it. And so, if they don't understand it in that context, how can they do emergency response?
Right. It's
and respirators aren't for emergency response anyway. I mean, air purifying respirators aren't for emergency response.
No, but you have post-response cleanups and you have other things, right? I mean, I don't think you want your safety officer to... Anyway, there's a lot to safety, right? It's not just assigning a guy with a checklist and who's had the same training everyone else has. And like you said, it's not specified what training they get. So, we're left with a performance-oriented situation where they need to have the knowledge and authority. So how much knowledge, do they need to have to actually speak with authority and be respected by the incident command, incident commander or the unified command, that structure? They really should be a resource and know what they're talking about safety. So, if you have to know some things about safety to run a regular safety program for a company, no matter how big, then don't you have to know that much more to do it during an emergency response?
Well, absolutely. And so many times I've seen company safety officers who were just line employees who happened to get all their preventative maintenance done. And hey, they've got a position to promote them into management. You want to be the safety officer. And it just seems to me that when you do something like that, you don't want to spend the money on an industrial hygienist or a certified safety professional. No. That even when you're saying that safety is number one, I mean, it clearly isn't. Mm-hmm. So, I know that I'm looking at developing my own safety officer standard that says you'll be trained for A, B, C, D, and E in order to be qualified as a safety officer. And I haven't written that yet. I was going to talk to you about that at some point. But starting off with, you must be incident commander qualified. For OSHA, that means that you are trained at the operations level, that you could understand the incident command system, that you're able to implement the employer's emergency response plan, that you understand the hazards of chemical protective clothing, that you're able to do hazard and risk assessment, you understand how to do decon and how to terminate an incident. So right there, a safety officer should, as a foundation, should be qualified at that level. And then there may be some additional things that are industry specific. I mean, we can look at the hazards that we can expect to find on shipboard, although in some cases, like container ships, who knows what's in those containers? They're often incorrectly placarded or not placarded at all.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, but you can plan on that based on basic response strategy by not getting overexcited about it or underexcited about it, right? And I think in addition to the incident commander training you're talking about, which I'm all for, by the way, you're talking me into it. Not that you had to, right? But right. The more you talk about it, the more I get behind that. But I think you also need some training and risk assessment. I mean, you're not born with it necessarily. You can't say, oh, that burner's hot. If I put my hand there, I'm going to get burned, right? I mean, we all have a little bit of it, but there's actual techniques and there's proportionality and priorities, right? And in a safety, you got to be thinking about the big stuff first. You got to, right? Make sure no one's dead and make sure no one has anything amputated. Make sure they're not going to be burned, right? And then you work toward whether they're going to trip. And granted, you could trip and hit your head on a table and die or whatever, but what is unique to the incident and a focus on that, bringing people real information that they can protect themselves with. I'd almost like to see those safety briefings at the end be something more like, look, and we have all the usual hazards of working outside, right? And that just includes your bee stings, snake bites. We don't have to talk about them individually. They're not proportionally more there at that scene. I mean, if I was at a snake zoo, right, I would be talking about snakes, right? But if I'm not at a snake zoo, I can just say, look, we've got all our normal hazards of our normal stuff. If you're working at height, you got to, keep your wits about you, slow down a little bit, really think it through. Because not only do we have that stuff, but, we have an emergency, which makes it more stressful. But there should be no time spent on that crap. I mean, honestly, that should just be part of every responder's basic training. And those things don't need a mention. What needs to be talked about is the stuff you're running into that's unique to that incident, not a cover your CYA. Is how I should say it. Not a CYA of, the insurance company. Yeah, we mentioned that in the safety briefing. Well, everyone was asleep by then. So, it's one of the tenets of training is not just did you cover it, but did people receive it? Was it understood that training is a two-way street, right? It's not a one-way, I told them. So I think we need to get out of that CYA on these things. And when we're talking to people in the response structure, give them that basic level of training. And then when we get to the incident, talk about things that are about the incident. What do you think about that, Dan?
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think that's why we're having this conversation. I just feel like people say, well, to be a good safety officer, all you need is, some good common sense. And, I would argue, and I know you've heard me say it before, that in the hazmat world, in the firefighting world, in the oil spill response world, there's no such thing as common sense. It's information that you have learned. You think the people who were grinding out tunnels, breathing silica dust and dying of lung disease, dying of silicosis, do you think they did that on purpose? Do you think that it was common sense that that's what's going to happen? That it was common sense that asbestos caused lung disease, or that mercury used by hatters caused insanity? People wouldn't do it on purpose if they knew, but we only know because people died and that knowledge became available to us. Common sense is something we learned far enough back in our life. You mentioned the stove being hot. At some point, your mom told you, hey, don't touch the stove, it's hot. And you're like, okay, the stove's hot. You didn't know. You had no earthly clue until one day you put your hand on the stove. You're like, damn thing's hot. And then you learned something that day, and that knowledge was so ingrained that we call that common sense. You know that information, but humans aren't like bees, born knowing how to make a hive or ants or something. We have to learn the only things that we know how to do when we're born is breathe and eat and poop. And that's it.
And I think here's the thing with safety is you can't have everything happen to you or you'd be dead already, right? You've got to be, the wisdom is being able to understand what's happened to other people and be able to not do that, right? So we're fighting human tendencies a little bit, right? Because we have to learn from other people's mistakes. And in order to learn from other people's mistakes, we have to know about them. We have to be trained in that. We have to know what the hazard is to control the approach for the organization. So there's some art and science in the safety world, and there's some wisdom where you don't have to experience every horrible death everyone else has, right? You can actually, avoid those without doing it yourself. So,
well, that's exactly right. We have to be looking at the accidents that are taking place, looking at the OSHA bulletins, and keeping our knowledge up to date. There was that accident at a poultry farm. Was that Georgia? Last year or early this year was a nitrogen release.
Yeah.
And, nitrogen is non-toxic. I'm breathing it right now. 78% of the air we breathe is nitrogen. It's non-flammable. Otherwise, the whole planet would be on fire right now. It's non-flammable. It's non-toxic. But yet 5 people died at this release, and another 8 or 10 people, or I don't remember the exact number, went to the emergency room because it's heavier than air. It displaces oxygen. Certainly,
when it's cold, yeah,
when it's cold, and certainly once it warms up and disperses within the rest of the air in the atmosphere, it's no big deal. But initially, in high concentrations, when it's cold, when it's near the ground, it acts as a common asphyxiant, and those people, they died of oxygen deprivation.
Well, and there's a concept in emergency. The closer you get to the hazard, right, the more acute the risks become. In a lot of ways, it's not true all the time. Like if it's a contact hazard, you could walk right up to it as long as you don't put your hand in it, right? You have an issue. But in general, and in response, we're trying to approach, instead of everyone else running the other way, we protect that community and we protect the people who shouldn't be there and have essentials only. But then our response has to guarantee the safety of the people in our care. And on something like that, you have a big amount of nitrogen at your facility, there should be some definite expertise and engineering controls that relate to how that nitrogen is handled, alarms that go off, right, for low oxygen. I don't know the details of that particular incident, but I know the details of 20 others, and we know that the problem is frostbite from the liquid and even the gas as it's evaporating, and we know that it displaces oxygen, right? So, and the closer you get, the more likely you are to risk those things. So, and our circle doesn't have to be as great as with a toxic chemical, perhaps, right? Because like you said, it's going to mix with air, and you're going to have enough oxygen in that air once it's mixed. So our safety officer needs to understand the behavior, the hazards of the material and the behavior of the material to be able to protect the responders. And, hopefully we can start kind of getting them the training that they need in order to be a real help to the incident commander. I mean, as you do this incident command stuff all the time. I mean, that's a big responsibility. You have people going into dangerous situations that are by nature uncontrolled and developing, and you don't want anyone to die on your watch, right? What's one of the best things you can do is you can have a strong right hand who knows what the heck they're doing, right? Not somebody, checking all the boxes, and it's so much a response is kind of revolved around it. I mean, we both know a lot of the stuff a lot of the stuff spilled doesn't get recovered. I mean, you do the very best you can. And in some cases, there's even some dog and pony show aspects, right? But not with the safety of your, responders, basically. And this having that strong safety officer with that incredible training protects the liabilities of the company, It protects the safety of the responders. And you can imagine, Dan, you're the IC and something happens on your watch, right? If you did everything you could and you understand it and you have a strong safety person, things shouldn't happen. But you're going to be a busy person being an incident commander. I don't know that you'd want a box checker next to you.
Well, I agree, and so that's why I'm looking at it so closely. I could go on for 4 hours, but I don't think I need to.
Right. Yeah. So I think there's some interesting stuff here, and you and I had talked before. This is an underutilized and capitalized area where there could be some pretty amazing improvement that would improve everyone's life, and get them out of those terrible safety briefings and into something that's really meaningful. But I think I just want to kind of, before we close, Dennis, talk about, identifying the hazard, right? Understanding those hazards, or getting the people that do understand them, other things in the material that could be involved in the incident. What form is it? Is it a solid, a liquid, a gas? How could it get involved? What are some of the hazards of just those states of matter? Reactions you brought up. That's a good thing to spend some time on thinking about early on in an incident, or for the safety officer to do. Obviously, downwind, offsite concerns, death first, explosives, then fire, and then, toxicity, oxygen deficiency, right? Risks that could arise for that. Monitoring, are you using the right monitoring stuff? You could be getting numbers in an incident commander. You need someone who really understands monitoring to be looking after that on the safety officer side, so you don't have to have all those numbers necessarily in front of you, and can really be watching your back on that. Then you just have all the other safety stuff. They understand safety in the depth needed to run a safety program during an emergency response.
Yeah, in a number of, I haven't done it for a while, but in a number of big tabletop exercises, when I was running the sim cell, and they safety officer would ask for current air monitoring readings from the field, and I would give some really wacky readings, and the response that I was looking for from the safety officer was, hey, was that instrument calibrated? Where are you located? I mean, those readings don't make sense. So
you just write them down.
Right, they just write them down, right? I'll give them, 255 parts per million carbon monoxide. Well, why is there carbon monoxide? The answer is you're standing by the exhaust of the boat. Get into some fresh air. But they're like, yeah, okay, 255 parts per million carbon monoxide. It's 600 parts per million VOCs, right? And literally, I get no pushback. They literally write them down, and I don't know if the incident commander in the drill ever sees them. But
they're not thinking. They don't know how to think about it.
No.
We've run into it. I've told you I've used flashcards before, right? And I'll hold up an air monitor reading in a training class, and people don't know. You can cover all the concepts when it comes to get that reading, assimilate what it means, right? And decide what you should do based on it. It's flatline.
Yeah. You tell them we're at 12% of the LEL. Yeah. You get nothing. They should be telling everyone to evacuate.
Yeah.
Even if they think, well, that's not likely or really possible for what we have spilled, unless we've spilled something other than what you told me.
Right, and that should be a clue to the safety officer that something's going on that they haven't identified. Right.
Right.
Right. But it isn't. I haven't had it. Anyway, it's experience. That's the kind of thing a safety officer should be drilling on. Is instead of just doing these big drills and here I am wearing the vest or whatever, it should be drilling on, hey, I'm getting these readings. What do they mean?
Yeah. Why do you
What
have
should we
20?
do?
Why do you have 20.1% oxygen instead of 20.9? Sure, it's not under the 19.5 that OSHA says is unsafe for confined space entry, but what is present that's caused that oxygen to be displaced?
Yeah.
You know?
You better know the answer, or you don't have any business, sending people in.
Right. But so often the answer is, well, it's not 19.5. We're okay. So
Yeah.
if there's even that much knowledge.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, Amy.
That brings up some good points, doesn't it?
It does.
As we get to a model competent response where everything clicks along and everybody's, helping each other succeed, this is key, I think.
Well, Amy Duz from iWorkWise, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Tactics Meeting. If you enjoyed the show, please help us spread the word. I ask this every week, so I'll ask again. Please send an email, recommend us to a friend. We would really like to reach as many people as possible. I hope to see you at Clean Pacific, August 17th and 18th in Renton, Washington. And until then, stay safe.